Just look back, like turning halfway back, there was a time when history and theory was abandoned for absolutely no good reasons, but the obsession with action and getting forms out of machines in order to make buildings as fast as possible, one more ridiculous than the other. It is interesting what happens when things slow down. So the question we have today is, are we going to return to theory? And are we going to return to history again? Are we going to reflect? Because that wave of hope we had, that all of that stuff was gone, and we don't need to reflect anymore. We have it. We figured it out. We got rid of the commies, and we're now on the wave of capitalism. Everything will be fine and dandy. We don't need to worry about anything. And suddenly, we realized that it was all a Ponzi scheme. And that, of course, is not particularly comforting for those of us who have lived in this luxury for years. But it's also an opportunity, a time to reflect, because as it turns out, it's very difficult to exist without reflection. And the university, of course, is the center for reflection. That's our task, that's our job. So history and theory are extremely important for us. In fact, I don't think we can exist without them. And we should never stop to think in those terms. We should never stop to reflect. There's always, since history is invented, we always have to reinvent it. And can always be rewritten and understood in new ways. So it's an enterprise we cannot abandon. Because abandoning that, we abandon our own culture, who we are as a very interesting nation that now is embarking on something quite radical and interesting. So, it is terrific to have Beatriz Colomina here. Like so many Americans, she was originally from another place, came here, studied intently, and became part of the woodwork, and has been at Princeton for a long time, reflecting upon what we do in various ways. And particularly on things like our practice in the light of the media, and on sexuality, and today on blurred vision, which happens to come to us older people more rapidly than we would like. So I hope she will tell us how to see. Beatriz Colomina.
Well, you can count on Lars to give a nice introduction. Thank you very much for all of you to be here. I'm very happy to be back in Ries. I was here maybe already 10 years ago when I was working on the Mies house and in other occasions. So I have very good memories of this place, and also a good relationship in the sense that there's always these students that come from Ries and end up doing graduate school at Princeton. So there's always been this relationship between Princeton and Ries, and we have very warm feelings for this school, which, despite what just Lars said, we all think that has been a very thoughtful, very wonderful school that has always kept that capacity to think about architecture at the same time that you do architecture, right? Blurred visions, architectural surveillance. Well, Lars just said that I talk about that I normally have focused on the media, and that's correct. In particular, I have been very interested, and this is the subject of this lecture, on the relationship between glass and the technologies of communication. This really has been like a constant theme in my research. I have tried to demonstrate that the history of the modern window is also a history of communication. That, for example, Le Corbusier horizontal window is unthinkable outside cinema. And not only because Le Corbusier was very interested in film. I mean, he considered film the most appropriate medium to represent modern architecture, better than photographs, better than maquettes, better than drawings. He thought that film was the medium, a medium that was, of course, developing in the same years than modern architecture, but because the frame itself of the horizontal window, that frame that Auguste Perret ended up accusing Le Corbusier, his great master Perret, imagine the trauma, no? Telling Le Corbusier in a very public way, in a public, in the most important newspaper in Paris, that his architecture was not architecture at all, right? Because of the horizontal window, because the horizontal window, unlike La Porte-Fenêtre of France, the door window, precisely provides you with a vision, in perspectival vision, in which you see the landscape as in a painting, right? But he says very clearly, Perret, that the horizontal window cuts up from the field of vision precisely the two bands of the foreground and the you know, only with the middle ground, and therefore turning the landscape into a flat picture sticking to the window, right? So what is that? Right? It's flat, it's horizontal, it cannot be thought outside precisely of cinema. And there is this incredible displacement from the view of the traditional window to this horizontal window. I think one has to go back to these kinds of polemics to understand how radical that was, because now we look at a horizontal window and we don't think much about it, right? Yeah, that's, you know, a modern architecture, but that's not architecture at all, just because of the window, right? Likewise, you can say, and I think I argued here a few years ago, that the Mies house is unthinkable outside the color slide that was introduced also during these years, and the medium that the Mies use predominantly to represent their architecture. Even their films, the film House After 5 Years of Living, is entirely made of thousands and thousands of slides that they themselves have taken over the course of the 5 years that they have lived in the house when they did the film, right? So you see what is happening, right? We go from the professional shot by a professional photographer in black and white that Le Corbusier had, right? To the snapshots that anybody can take, that cost nothing, that are slides, that are mounted in multiple ways. And it's not just a unique view of the world, but a kaleidoscopic, colorful view, which corresponds, by the way, to the architecture of the house. Right? Think about the frames for a view that the house makes possible, also very much related to the slide. I'm going very fast here, but I'm just going quickly to the picture window of the typical house at mid-century, which you could argue, or I have argued, that is unthinkable outside television and so on. We could keep going. But the principle here is that in each case, the ambitions of modern architecture to dissolve the line between inside and outside is realized precisely by absorbing the latest technologies of communication. So communication is basically all about bringing the outside in, for example, by reading the newspaper or by getting a letter. And I think it's not an accident that this is like a mailman, right? A mailman arriving in this house to bring a letter in this kind of incredible scene there with these little girls there, the two twins, and they're, it's an advertisement actually for Pella windows, an advertisement for picture windows in the 1950s. So if communication is always about bringing the outside in by reading the newspaper, by getting a letter, and I'm of course thinking about the most basic forms of communication, not involving any kind of complicated technology, or about bringing the inside out, as for example sending a letter, then glass precisely represents this act of communication. And it's almost as if glass took over more and more of the building as the systems of communication became more and more fluid. That is, having then dissolved the walls with glass, or into glass, the question has become how to dissolve glass itself. The last, if you want, delicate line between inside and outside. The relentless quest for a greater fluidity between inside and outside, as you will see, is no longer simply a drive towards transparency. The glass box of our times have become something else. I'm thinking, of course, to the work of Sejima, Kazuyo Sejima, that I will talk later on. But before that, to show this transition, I want to go back to the house at mid-century, to reflect again on the glass house of Philip Johnson, for example, or of Mies van der Rohe, and then go back to SANAA. The first thing that you think about when you think about Philip Johnson is, of course, his glass house. And this is another thing that I want to introduce here. What if the primary source of our research was not the mountain of articles that have been written and books about this house over the years, all these scholarships on this house? What if we were to look as a research material to the many television programs that Philip Johnson was part of from the very beginning, from 1951, and nobody has looked at them, and this is an amazing source of a scholarship. So, you know, the hypothesis, if I want to present it here, advanced here, will be: what if the glass house was made for TV? What if Johnson himself was made for TV? Right? So let's introduce this other kind of thread here. And let me show you a clip of Johnson, because the glass house is amazing, because it appears in all the television programs, not only at the time or near the time of its construction, but when Johnson was already very, very old. You will see that there are tons of clips where Johnson is at the end of his life, and it's in a television program, and the glass house ends up being at the center of the television program. So the glass house throughout all his life is like this kind of prop for his appearance on television.
My name is Rosamund Bernier. Philip Johnson and I have been friends for many years. As often as we can manage it, we get together and talk about everything from hemlock to hemorrhoids, with time out for forays into art, literature, highly motivated travel, and the best party of the season. We've talked sitting down and houses, trains, airplanes, but as Philip Johnson's natural temper is the quick march, we've also talked while walking from one place to another at a steady 4 miles an hour. But no matter where we start, we always end up with architecture. When you start in a design project, what are the very first steps that come through your mind?
Okay. This is Rosamund Bernier, as you know. I mean, this is incredibly difficult. This is the only kind of thing that is incredibly difficult to do research on television, because the television people threw away the tapes there is no record. It's ridiculous, right? The Museum of Modern Art doesn't have almost anything. They have this one, they have a couple of other things, but they don't lend it to you. They don't have the right to lend it to you. So to obtain these things, I have to track down the person. So I figured that this Rosamund Bernier maybe was still alive. And there she was, living on Madison Avenue. And she's probably like 90, right? And she's an unbelievable person. So I went to see her, and she was, of course, delighted, you know. She wanted to talk, and she had gotten married in the Philip Johnson glass house, and she had pictures, I mean, of her wedding. I mean, it was an unbelievable story, but also she gave me the tape. Anyway, let me just go with the program. Really persistent dreams of the 20th century, that of the old glass house and that of television, were finally realized around the same time and in the same place, the suburbs of America. So if experiments with glass and glass fantasies have played a dominant role in science fiction and in modern architecture since at least the mid-19th century, only by the mid-20th century was the dream finally inhabited in Mies van der Rohe Farnsworth House in Plano, Illinois, and in Philip Johnson's glass house in New Canaan, Connecticut. Two spacecraft, you could say, have landed. The Farnsworth somehow floating just above the ground as if it was a craft coming into land, and the glass house finally resting on the ground, down on its solid path, anchored in place, and yet somewhat a raft in Johnson's world, or one could even say a flying carpet. What had been experimented in drawings, models, writings, and pavilions in fairs had become useful. As Lucan put it in a television program with Philip Johnson, this is another television program that I found, Lucan with Philip Johnson. Can you believe the conversation? No? Incredible. Philip Johnson says, "The glass house is a marvelous building because it stated very elegantly what was in the secret recesses of everybody's mind at the time of its conception. It brought out the picture of what modern architecture wanted to be, end of the quote. So the house then in this beautiful quote is an image then, a photograph of what everybody had in mind already, a dream in physical form, the dream of transparency finally inhabited. Here is a beautiful photograph of every photograph and every clip that I will show you here is either from the popular press, which is also completely neglected in our scholarship. We never look at Vogue, we never look at Life, we never look at Look, we never look at all this House and Garden, all these crappy magazines. And this is actually the best images are always, because they have the budget, they have the photographer. Look at the images of the glass house in Life magazine, for example, how marvelous they are. Anyway, the glass house represents, as I said, the realization of this century-old dream of a transparent house that extends from the science fiction like quality of Paul Serber, for example, images of glass buildings in an ideal future in his novels and in his 1914 collection of aphorisms, Glass Architecture, which was, by the way, dedicated to Bruno Taut, Bruno Taut's own glass house, the pavilion for the glass industry in the Bourbon exhibition in Cologne of 1914, here under construction. Okay. And you can think also, and here finish, or you can think about Mies van der Rohe and Lily Reich glass room in Stuttgart of 1927, or of course the German pavilion in the International Exhibition of Barcelona of 1929, or Mies Unrealized Project, again the pavilion of course, or again Mies Unrealized Project for a glass house on a hillside of 1934, or you can think about an American example, George Keck's Crystal House photograph with, you can see the Bucky Fuller Diamaxion car parked in the garage, which was for 1934, this house in the 1933-34, the Century of Progress International Exhibition in Chicago, and so on. All these dreams of a transparent house that tended to be either drawings, as in the case of Mies, or pavilions in fairs. But by 1949, this dream of a house defined only by glass walls, or we could even say the absence of wall, was finally realized in Mies and Johnson's houses. And here you have the Johnson house, the Mies house not even finished yet, and the Johnson house. But the absence of traditional walls doesn't mean, of course, that the inhabitants of glass houses are exposed. As a Danish reported traveling in America in the post-war years, and he hadn't seen the glass house of Johnson or the glass house of Mies. He was just talking about, he was surprised by the big picture windows in the typical American house. And he says something unbelievable. He says, a glass house bespeaks more security than a stone house because the owner can afford to dispense with the safety of the stone, end of the quote. Or as Johnson said of his own house, again in another television program, 1965 CBS program, This is Philip Johnson, he says of the house that it was an opportunity to live in the woods. So I think these photographs that are not so well known of the house quite capture it. He insisted, Johnson insisted, and this is a beautiful idea too, that a wall is only an idea in your mind. If you have a sense of enclosure, you are in a room. And to the repeated question of whether his house was kind of a fishbowl that exposed his body to the eyes of others, he answered that in the 16 years that he had lived in the house, nobody had come up to glue their faces in the glass. And then he says, I think it is because people are afraid that you are looking at them. So it's very beautiful because he turns it around. It's them that they are afraid that you are looking at them. And of course, he is clearly pointing out something that is obvious, which is that the glass house operates both ways, as artists like Dan Graham in this work of the 1970s alteration to a suburban house had been exploring. But Johnson didn't even experience the glass as transparent, but precisely as wallpaper. in another television program, and this is a photograph of the glass house, but it will also be a pavilion of Dan Grant, right? I mean, the same kind of play of reflections. He says, the glass house works very well for the simple reason that the wallpaper is so handsome. It is perhaps a very expensive wallpaper, but you have wallpaper that changes every 5 minutes throughout the day and surrounds you with the beautiful nature that sometimes, not this year, Connecticut gives us. So the glass, in Johnson's understanding, provides enclosure, containment, rather than openness. And here is the classical, the canonic picture of Johnson sitting at his desk inside the glass house with this effect of the wallpaper all around him. He says in another television program, I built this house shortly after Mies van der Rohe gave us all the model with his famous glass house near Chicago. This one came first, so people think I'm original. I'm not. I knew the plans of the Farnsworth house very well, but of course there are differences. I wanted to live on the ground. Let me show you the models, because this is the model, of course, of the Farnsworth house in 1947. Now under construction, that was already circulating in the press, and of course Johnson is right, he knew it, but he also likes to say that he knew it. So before anybody says that he is derivative, he's already saying, no, I copied, this is a minor copy, right? And also look at the model, because look, it's black, which is also interesting. And look at this little model of the glass house of Johnson, which also is a still from one of these television programs. I've never been able to find that image of the model, which is of course a completely different project than the one finally realized. Anyway, so he says, but of course there are differences. I wanted to live on the ground. I wanted to be contained. I don't believe in indoors, outdoors architecture. What you want is a contained house to cuddle you, to hold you near the heart. You want to get your back up to a fireplace. Any Anglo-Saxon does. Maybe the Italians don't care so much about it, but we do. So this house is contained. I must admit, he says, that the containment is a rather small feature, a black band that runs around the house, this black band, but it keeps the landscape away. It turns the landscape into a kind of wallpaper, expensive wallpaper to be sure, but wallpaper where the sun and the moon and the stars make different patterns, end of the quote. So it is precisely this sense of complete envelopment that makes this minimalist statement into architecture. If you are in a good piece of architecture, Johnson says, you have the feeling that you are surrounded. So rather than dematerialized architecture, the glass, in Johnson's view, reinforces precisely its traditional value, its traditional role of containing, right? Architecture, he says, is how you enclose a space. That's why I hate photographs, television, and motion pictures, she says precisely during the same television program. So in the middle of the television program, making extensive use of television, he says he hates television. Here is another clip.
This house I built shortly after Mies van der Rohe gave us all the model in his famous glass house near Chicago. I built this one first so people think I'm original. I'm not. Mies van der Rohe built the first great glass house, and this is sort of a minor copy of it. Of course, there are differences, because Mies and I didn't see the same way about living. I wanted to live on the ground. I wanted to be contained. I don't believe in indoor-outdoor architecture, in spite of the looks of this house, that it just as if it was supposed to be connected with the landscape. How about it? Downward landscaping. What you want is a contained house to cuddle you, to hold you with a heart. You want to get you back up to a fireplace. Any Anglo-Saxon does. Maybe the Italians don't care so much about it, but we do. And our original thought is to get up to a heart and be contained. So this house is contained. I must admit the containment's rather a small little feature of a black band that runs around the house, but it keeps the landscape away. It turns the landscape into a kind of wallpaper. Expensive wallpaper, to be sure. But the wallpaper, where the sun and the moon and the stars make different patterns. How does this house held together? That was Mies's great passion. What does that column do? What happens between those two columns? He once asked me, how was the roof built? And I said, it's a wooden roof, just the way we always build in America. He says, aren't you ashamed? I hadn't thought it was moral or immoral to build a wooden roof. But you see, to him, that was a treason, that if you build a building like this, of course it has a concrete roof. I don't care what's behind what I can see. That's for the technicians to do. Let them jam straw in there if they want to. It's how this piece of sculpture gets around you, how you walk into it, and how you get out of it, and how it influences you around behind. It's why I hate photography. It's why I hate television and the motion picture, because they look straight at you like this. You try to pan a camera and see what happens. The space goes around your head until you're dizzy. You can't appreciate space in a movie. It doesn't, it's a frontal.
Okay. So you get a sense of the character too. This is a minor copy. I copied from Mies, right? I mean, the whole thing about the roof and the, I don't care what is in there. I mean, it's very interesting to look at these characters on television because you learn so much more than just reading. And also because what they tend to say on television, as you will see, is a lot more interesting than what they write, which is really boring. In any case, television also arrived in the United States at mid-century, and it was also a long part of science fiction fantasies of the future. Television was featured or had its first public demonstration in 1927, prompting Buckminster Fuller to state that his Dymaxion house, designed the same year, was organized around a television communication center. Now pay attention, because this always happens. Whenever there is a new technology of communication, even the hint, the smell of a new technology of communication, there is already an architect saying that whatever project they are doing is organized around this new technology of communication. He claimed, here is of course Bucky Fuller with his model of the Dymaxion house. He claimed that the house was equipped with the latest media technology: telephone, radio, television, phonograph, dictaphone, loudspeaker, microphone, and so on. But of course, some of these technologies barely existed in 1927. Only in the late 1940s and 50s was television widely introduced to the American public, when Dumont and RCA offered their first sets to the public in 1946. And between 1948 and 1955, nearly 2/3 of Americans or American families bought a television set. In 1950, the most famous of all the mass-produced suburbs in America, Levittown in Long Island, offered a television set built into the walls of their prefabricated Cape Cod houses. You see here the couple. This is an early moment where the couple is in the middle with all this, $25 down, and it includes all these appliances, including the television, right? But the year after, the television is not just an appliance in the middle, but has been incorporated into the wall, has become part of the wall. So you can say that television at that point had become part of the architecture of the American house. Of course, with all this talk of television and these images now, you probably are thinking that nothing could be farther away from the wall of a higher wall of a Mies or a Johnson, right? But yet, in one of these little books that is a talk of Mies with his students, there is one of them, one of his former students, Edward. I love these books of conversations with the students. And you did one, right, in Rice here with Kurhas. No, it was a very interesting tradition, I think. Anyway, one of them, Edward Duckett, says he liked boxing, or at least he liked or he enjoyed watching it on television. And the other one, Fujikawa, says, oh yeah, he had the largest television screen of anybody I knew. I think Herb Greenberg picked it out for him. So now you have a completely different vision of Mies, right? From the one that is depicted in all the architecture books, the serious Mies with his art collection and his views of architecture and all of this. And now you have that he has the biggest television set that anybody, I know you never hear about Mies watching television. Maybe you hear about him drinking a bit too much, but about the television, we never hear about it because television is always excluded from all these stories. Anyway, who is this Greenwald that gave him the television? Greenwald, here he is or was a rabbinical scholar who became a real estate developer, did fantastic things with Mies. They met in 1946, and between the two of them, they built projects like the famous Lakeshore Drive apartments in Chicago, twin 25-story glass and steel structures in the shores of Lake Michigan, containing 275 glass apartments each. The project represented, according to a reporter of the time, I think this is an interesting comment, he says, and he could only have said that after talking with Mies, the fulfillment of Mies' 30-year-old dream of a skin and bones construction. And then he goes on to say that Mies wanted to give city apartment dwellers the feeling of living close to the outdoors, as people in the suburbs do, with have floor-to-ceiling picture windows in their houses. So if this is correct, if that's what Mies told him, then Lakeshore Drive apartments will be precisely about bringing the suburbs to the city, as if stacking suburban houses on top of each other. The apartments are, of course, glass houses suspended in the air. Their walls allow embrace-taking views of the lake from every apartment, but at the same time to turning each apartment into a display. You have two towers, two twin towers, one in front of the other. So particularly at night, the towers become like multiplex theaters, providing an audience for each other, almost like a reality television, much more interesting than television at that time. You know, imagine, nobody seems to care about the curtains, right? Those are photographs from Life magazine of the Lakeshore Drive apartments. Each tower, remember there are two towers, one, they look to its identical twin as if it were in a mirror image. Inhabitants seem to have been perfectly at ease, as one of the first tenants put it. I feel quite tucked in and not nearly as exposed as I thought I would feel now that the furniture is in place. And here this kind of double or triple exposure photograph, also from Life. Johnson's glass house, built at the same time that most Americans own a television set, avoid all media technology. There was no television inside in any of the images of Johnson's houses, including this house, the Hodgson House, which is across the street from the glass house in Connecticut, in New Canaan, of 1951. And the client was a CBS executive, so imagine if he was to have not one television but many televisions. But all the architectural journals removed the televisions before photographing. And Johnson, in the interview, insists on television, insists that the glass house has no television, no telephone, no gramophone, no noise of any kind. So no noise in a house that we could argue that was designed precisely for the media, or no media in a house designed for the media. And yet, we could argue that the glass house was itself operating as a television set, but not in the obvious sense of the views that the house makes possible. That is, if one could argue that the post-war, the typical post-war suburban house, operates like a television set, broadcasting family lives through the picture window, the Johnson house closes itself to the outside much more radically than a stone house to become precisely a television broadcasting studio. I think the model, as you will see, was picked up later by authorities on the American house, like Martha Stewart, here in photographs when Koolhaas and I went to interview her. And he has these houses, he uses these houses that he has in Connecticut as a broadcast studio. She has this country estate in Westport, Connecticut, with a series of model houses in the same way that Johnson has his estate, with a series of model structures built over the years. This is actually in New York, in that big loft that he has. He has these kind of arrangements of different, and it's actually like an architectural office, because he has all these models of cakes and everything. And the rooms where they make these models are like architectural school rooms, you know, with all this cardboard and wood, etc. Well, Johnson preceded her in a way, because also in his estate, he built over the year a number of model structures. Each one, as you will see, becomes an opportunity for him to broadcast. Each time the glass house seems to run out of steam, then Johnson builds a new pavilion, one that renews the discussion of both the earlier glass house and of himself. What Johnson calls in another interview, getting an itch. He says, I keep building around the place because I get itchy. He says, nobody asked me to build funny things, so I do them for myself. Clients always want something definite with toilets and other unnecessary gadgets, but I can always build what I like for myself. So every 5 or 6 years, I build another funny thing, end of the quote. The glass house was built in 1949. The brick house that you can see here on the left with the round windows is also from 1949 and now and then renewed in 1953. Again, this beautiful image is from life. The pavilion in the lake was added in 1962. The swimming pool that Johnson insisted was an essential part of the composition wasn't built until 1963. In 1965, he says, I had some pictures I wanted to hang, so I thought, good opportunity, we will try something funny for a gallery. And since I didn't want to build it too close to the glass house, I put it in a bunker. People think it's an underground gallery, but it's not underground at all. 1970 was the sculpture gallery. I had nothing to build for a long time, and about 1978, I got itchy again. The land next door came for sale, so I kept expanding, so the studio was built in 1980, the Lincoln Kirsten Tower and the Ghost House. In 1985, this is the Lincoln Kirsten Tower. And a visitor's pavilion, the Monster, was built in 1995 in preparation for the house becoming a national monument. Is the kind of the reception place. Let me show you another clip of.
He began to think small and build small and have a very good time. Sometimes the constructions that resulted are very small indeed, and sometimes they have a secret purpose, like the tiny pavilion by the pond that was built purely as an architectural exercise to find out how to turn a corner with a column. The latest exercise of that kind is what he calls his Lincoln Kirsten Tower. Lincoln Kirsten, co-founder and present director of the New York City Ballet, is one of his closest friends, by the way. But when Philip dared me to try it, I wasn't going to say no. But the steps are all on the outside, and it calls for a certain agility. Getting down is even more tricky. But guess who went up and down like a mountain goat with his 80th birthday just around the corner?
So 80th birthday, and this is Thor, believe me. I mean, we went to the, I took the students from Princeton, Eva was then a student, to see the glass house before it became a monument. And I'm telling you, nobody went up that tower, right? And you can see him totally comfortable. She's terrified, obviously. You see how she holds on, and really when he goes up, like, there is no problem. Anyway, the official story passed on in architectural scholarship is that the glass house is like Johnson's laboratory. As Johnson himself put it, I consider my own house not so much a home, I thought it is that for me, but as a clearing house of ideas which can filter down later through my own work or that of others. What he doesn't tell us then is that the house is platform for him in the media, and not only, as I was saying, the professional media of the architectural journals. He's always there, in Forum, in all the architectural publications, but also the popular media of Life magazine, Vogue, This is Life, Look, House Beautiful, Ladies' Home Journal, the New York Times, you know, anything, you name it, and there it is. Johnson, as I say, sometimes is where you see the first color photographs, sometimes you see the best photographs precisely in this popular press, right? And so on. Johnson also, as I say, appeared with astonishing regularity in television programs from the 1951 first CBS interview to his last interview with Charlie Ross in PBS. And this is the amazing thing, that the house is almost always at the center of these programs, every new construction allowing him an opportunity for reviving the fire. It's not only American television, he was also on BBC with Susan Sontag. I mean, can you believe it? An unbelievable interview. So, what is this house, right? That is always at the center. You see him is quite old right here in the last interview with Charlie Ross for PBS. And again, the house is at the center.
Then the house that some people still believe is the best thing you could ever done.
We got a lot of people think they only do it.
Well, that's true, they do.
That's not men's words around
No,
here.
of course not. Let's get right. How do you characterize this building we're about to see? Roll tape. Let's look at this, or show tape. This is the house that you built for yourself, New Canaan, Connecticut.
The point here was only to say, again, you know, this is very late in his life, and again, the house becomes the center of his, and also his kind of all self-deprecating comments, right? Like, oh yeah, most people think that that's the only thing I ever did, right? I mean, so before anybody says that that's the best thing he does, he himself says, the only thing he did. In fact, the best descriptions of this house, I think, are still those of Johnson, particularly Johnson, as I say, in the popular press, where he seems to be more free to see whatever he wants. He likens his house to a celestial elevator, he says. I love this idea, in which when it snows, you seem to be going up because everything else is coming down. The house, in a way, levitates, right? Like with the common experience of being in a railway station, right? And you're sitting in your train, and all of a sudden you feel like your train is moving, but then you realize that your train is actually not moving, that it's the train across the track that is moving. But I imagine the same kind of sense of displacement, the same kind of disorientation, except that now, of course, the movement is vertical rather than horizontal, as it is in the train or in a house of Mies or in a house of Le Corbusier, where the framing is relentlessly horizontal, as we saw before. And this is precisely the point at which the glass house, described by Michael Graves as being more Miesian than Mies, precisely departs from this lineage. What is curious about the idea of an elevator is that Johnson also repeatedly noted how much he disliked elevators, how elevators represented the end of architecture, the end of the experience of space in movement. Of the Seagram building, for example, he wrote, unfortunately, the entire experience of the Seagram building leads but to the elevator. That claustrophobic box brings visual, processional beauty to a complete dead stop. The visitor can only be restored, if at all, by looking out of a high window. Elevators are here to stay, but one is not forced to love them, end of the quote. So it seems as if this hate for the elevator, this claustrophobia of the elevator, goes away when there is only the elevator in the landscape. The glass house for Johnson is a free box, a glass elevator with 4 doors. As you know, the glass house has 4 doors. Stay clear then. The containing gesture is now exactly what allows the box to move. Even the black band that we talked about before going around the glass makes sense now. If it was something to hold on when the box moves. This is band that is very, I think we all the foreigners notice that when we arrive in America, because in other countries they don't have anything to hold, and first you go like, why is that, right, going around the elevator? Already in 1947, in his book on Mies accompanying the exhibition at MoMA, Johnson had described the Farnsworth House, and here you have the Farnsworth House already kind of flooded, and it's not finished yet, as you can see. And he has described it outside apart from the flooding, real flooding. He described it as a floating, self-contained cage. And Henry Russell Hickshaw had described it as a beach yacht, he said, with no provision for outer living beyond the very confined space of a fly-screen deck and the small travertine dock below it. The idea of floating can also be found, as you can see here, in the popular press, in very early articles in the popular press, like, for example, this one in House and Garden, that calls the Farnsworth House a glass cell that floats in the air. So Johnson, what he does is happily picks up the same metaphor for his own house, describing it as floating in the sea, even if he dislikes the sea as much as he dislikes elevators. Listen to what he says about the sea. That's why I don't like the seaside. There is nothing there, unless there is a boat. If there is a boat, it's okay. In the East River of Manhattan, he means, wonderful barges go by, but God, keep me from the ocean, from the Atlantic Ocean. There are a lot of glass houses that face the ocean, and people like them, but I say there is nothing there. So if Mies is a beach yacht, Johnson would rather have his own house to be at sea, to be a raft at sea. He also describes, these are also images from the popular press, he also describes his own house, the glass house, as a Chinese box. He says you have a box. Then you take the lid off, and there is another one, and then another one, and then another one. So this is the same with his house. We have, he says, we start with this room, and he says, but it's a rather large room. It is the landscape from the forest on the road to the forest in the forest, and from the north to the south. So it's the big rectangle here. That's the room. Between the room, he says, we create a raft of a space, which is the green lawn around you. This green lawn is the other raft. On the green lawn, we make another raft, which is the house, separated entirely from the green lawn. And now, on this brown lawn, as if it were, he says, of the brick floor, we make another lawn, which is this white rag. So the living room is just this raft in the brown sea or the brown lawn, less mixed metaphor of the paving, that again is on the green lawn, which again is on the forest lawn around it. So here inside we have the microcosmos in the white rag, and there outside is the macrocosmos. So there's the microcosmos, the macrocosmos. To experience the house for Johnson is to move from floating raft to floating raft, each one providing a sense of containment. So a space here, in Johnson's understanding, I think is defined precisely by the outer lines of this raft, the lawn, the pavement, the rag. The glass house then is not a box, a glass box, but precisely a horizontal surface, a raft, drifting among other rafts and having raft between it. So this is the conception of a space, is this. So even if there is no box, it's defined by the limits, by the imaginary walls that are created by this horizontal surface, right? Then it begs the question of this horizontal movement that he describes so beautifully here. Is it contradictory with the idea of the vertical elevator, or with Johnson's this stage, or this like for glass houses by the seaside? Not at all. What Johnson does is accumulates metaphors and repeats them in different combinations. The raft lacks direction. It is floating in the sea, not looking at it from an anchor position, as does a modern house. It is a raft. If the raft is an enclosure, which it is, if it provides shelter from the sea, which it does, is in the vertical volume, as I said before, defined precisely by the surface of the raft. He says, in another television program, the intimacy of the raft is as great as the intimacy of a closed room. Pattern, and between the platform, the sand-colored carpet, like a raft, he said, in the ocean, exactly the same metaphors, right? Provides a safe passage for a low couch. That's Arthur Dressler. Now, is Arthur Dressler listening to Johnson, or was Johnson listening to Dressler? I really don't know, but I have the impression that Johnson did the same thing with the walls as he did with the design of the house, picking up ideas from everybody, from all critics, from all these other people. He was a sponge, soaking up things and refining them, simplifying them, like a television personality or a journalist reporting on his own life in an easily understood language. There is no real difference here between the reporter and the things being reported. Johnson was simply a television program, a reality TV show that ran longer than anybody could have imagined. Let me show you another clip of Johnson.
I would like to be on the wrong side of everything. Architecture, as I've often said, is much too important to leave the architects anyhow. Because architects would go off and do things like this that don't try any parsnips. Although some architects brag with being called prostitutes, I don't see why. It's a very old profession, it used to be a very noble one, where you do your best. And we're glad we want it.
You know what they say, Steve? You've said sometimes I'm a hope.
Well, that's a real very generic remark. You take out of context all the time. You mean to say you don't work for anybody?
No, I don't.
Boy, context. It's such a very bad word. For a very normal matter. I know I did it to make a colorful concept. It did. The Boston Paper lady we film out of horror doing our architecture in Boston.
We're just as small, just as self-centered, just as egotistical, just as mean as any soprano you've ever known. Or any ballet dancer. There's nothing worse, more difficult than that except a professor of biology.
Can you be a great architect without having a huge ego?
No. Usually better architecture.
Bigger ego.
Bigger ego, better architect.
Because we're going to talk about your propagandist qualities.
Everybody hates me now because I got involved in the profession so much, and I'm building more than any other architect. And Mayor, of course, is more interested in so-called cleaning up. He's more interested in cleaning up than we are. I rather enjoy some of the little shops that other people talk so bad about. I'm hoping we can keep some more interesting, quote-unquote, shops in the neighborhood. Otherwise, it's going to lose its flavor. Like a dog. When he comes into the room, goes around and around, you know, he sniffs his way around, and finally curls. With the second curl around, and this room does the same thing.
Who's taking over? The landscape gardeners, the urban planners?
The urban planners, of course, they all nibble away at our profession because we don't have the right words to strike the public right now. We aren't got words like synergistic. I'm not sure what that means, but I see it in the urban planners manuals. It's all very nice out there, but we've been building buildings before ecology, and I hope after ecology.
You see all the character, no? All his, I mean, they're clipped from different programs, and to the end of his life, he's so fast from the very beginning.
When you started a design project, what are the very first steps that come through your mind?
And the slightest idea. I think it's impossible in architecture to say what happens. You see, architecture is not a game that is translatable into the English language. As much as I admire Shakespeare, I just think it was lucky he didn't have to build buildings. Because how the deuce would he have translated his sonnets into stone? You see, you remember Richardson's famous phrase, the greatest American architect was not Franklin Wright, it was Henry Hobson Richardson. And he was so great that they asked him what the first principle of architecture was: get the job.
The job, right? That's a good. It's beautiful fact that get the job, right? I mean, so from the very beginning, it's amazing to watch him in 1951 because it's a time when they haven't started really, television hadn't started to have cultural programs that much, right? And you see the interviewers that they are uncomfortable, they don't know exactly what they are supposed to do. He knows exactly what he's supposed to do. He gives you exactly these kind of bits of information, you know, these kind of one-liners that are funny, that are fast, that are unbelievable. So he was really made for TV, and to the end of his life, he's being interviewed by Charlie Ross, a very experienced interviewer. He's unbearable, but he really is experienced. But he brings the question of the prostitution, and that he has said that the architect is a whore, blah, blah, blah. And he immediately turns, you see how fast he is? He immediately turns, you mean you don't work for anybody? Right? So he turns it against himself very quickly, right? But he also, you saw that other earlier program where he was talking about also about the architect as a whole, and it's a very old profession, and one that you know, one does its best, and one is happy that it's wanted, right? I mean, it's unbelievable because it's very precise. It's totally right? But he's able to do these things that catch your attention, and you are there, right? And he understood television in a way that Le Corbusier never did. This is an amazing thing because I started doing research on Le Corbusier, and television was also very interesting because not even the Le Corbusier Foundation knew that Le Corbusier had been so much on television, like 30 television programs. They don't have even one tape. They don't know anything. They say it doesn't exist, right? So I started doing more research, and I started finding letters, you know, BBC paying him, and you know, the French television. You know, but this guy is getting paid, so this television program have to exist. But he writes about television being the new medium and how it will be more important to communicate with television than with film in the 50s, and he makes huge efforts to appear on television, but he doesn't get it. He always, he tries to do like a lecture. He turns his back to the camera, he starts writing in the blackboard, he's really dry, he goes too long, then he starts writing letters, getting upset because the television program have cut, because he was really boring, right, for the public, he had cut the program, and you have cut precious things that I had, I was so generous of giving you, and, you know, so he ends up being disappointed and leaving it. So if Mies, if Le Corbusier was the first architect to fully engage with 20th century media, he stopped short of television. And television is the medium that he gets fascinated with, but in the end can never penetrate. And Johnson is the first architect to fully understand the medium of television, to the point that I don't think there's anybody so good still, you know. Anyway, let me move now very quickly to the glass house of SANAA, precisely because I want to talk about the difference. Everybody talks about the similarities between the glass pavilion and, in general, the architecture of Kazuyo Seijiman and the architecture of Mies. And of course, at first sight, the glass pavilion in the Toledo Museum of Art is the perfect example of transparency, an all-glass pavilion for all glass objects in the glass city of Toledo, Ohio. In this sense, SANAA inherited the Miesian tradition of radical transparency. In the standard publicity image that you saw here before of the project, the white trim pavilion sits in a park, uncannily echoing some of Mies' canonic projects, such as the ones that we have seen before, the Farnsworth House and the 50 by 50 house, for example. Mies famously deploys sheer glass walls to radically expose the interior. My interest in this particular phenomenon has been to explore, or one of my interests in this phenomenon has been to explore the possibility that transparency in modern architecture was directly related to medical technologies of imaging the body, like X-ray, right? From that point of view, the logic of the glass walls is exactly the same one of the X-rays. That is, the inner structure is revealed by a new technology that allows you to look through the outer skin of the body. Mies even described his work as a skin and bones architecture and refers to the structure of his glass skyscraper of 1922 as the skeleton, rendering it, now that you have the clue of the X-rays, if you think about it, it renders the project as if it was seen under an X-ray machine. Mies was actually deeply interested in X-ray machine, collected X-ray images, and used them as illustration in his own articles. For example, this is an article in the magazine, in the journal G that Mies was editing, where he puts this X-ray of the head of a woman next to the outline. But of course, Mies was not alone. All of them were interested in X-rays. They were fascinated by X-rays in the same way that you can say that architects of this generation that Lars was talking about before, the computer generation, was fascinated by other medical technologies like the CAT scan, and it's unthinkable you cannot separate their architecture from these images. I mean, think about Alejandro Zaira Polo project of Yokohama, which is really like a CAT scan of the body of the building, or think about, even they use the same images. You know, Ben van Berkel uses images of CAT scans of the brain in his books, Move, and Mateo of Spain, he has in the cover of his catalog, of his first catalog of his book, he has a brain scan. I mean, my God, of all the images that you could have in the cover of your book, why would you think you put a brain scan, right? Well, that's interesting because architects have always been interested in the technologies of representing the body. Since the Renaissance, architectural schools and schools of medicine were next to each other, and the same techniques of representing the body, the casts, were used in architectural schools and in medicine schools and in architecture. And we are still, I think, in this paradigm. We follow very closely what is happening in medicine. In any case, as I say, Mies was not alone. Very quickly here, you can say that books on modern architecture, once you have that clue, are filled with images of glowing glass skins, revealing inner bones and organs. Think about Mies, Le Corbusier's project, Le Corbusier's project for the glass skyscraper of 1925. Think about Walter Gropius, the Bourbon exhibition in Cologne. Think about the Van Nelle factory in Rotterdam, even at night more. Clearly an X-ray, the Socken department of Mendelssohn in Stuttgart, the Glass Palace in Herlin by Putz, 1935. Or we saw it before, the Keck Crystal House in the 1934 Fair of Chicago, or Buckminster Fuller Diamaxion House, Diamaxion Tower, or many other examples that will, I'm sure, come to you. But the point here is that these experimental designs from the early part of the 20th century became the basis of everyday building at mid-century, when the see-through house, and I have already shown this image 3 times, no, this is a different one, became a mass phenomena, and just at the same exact time that the X-ray itself became a mass phenomenon. Screening the body for tuberculosis meant precisely penetrating with the gaze areas of the body that were previously invisible. The technology had been available in sanatoria since the beginning of the century, but only by mid-century, mass X-raying of citizens became on a regular basis. With this development, the now visible interior of the body became not just a tool for diagnosis, but also the site of a new form of public surveillance. Policing the population by scrutinizing their insides, public institutions such as the schools and the military took over the management of the most private space of the body. Over a period of half a century, an experimental medical tool had been transformed into a mechanism of surveillance for the entire population. And this is the amazing thing, that if you look at popular literature, there is also this incredible association between X-rays and glass houses from the very beginning. So by mid-century, you have this commonplace in literature, for example, in popular culture. For example, there is a film called Highlights and Shadow, which is trying to convince people that they should not be afraid of X-rays and take X-rays. And there's this woman with the swimming suit in the photograph, and then the photographs in the film gives way to the image of her X-ray. And then the narrator, which is of course a man, he says, this young lady, listen to this, to whom henceforth a glass house will hold no terrors, will after an examination of her radiograph be reassured that she is physically fit. Did you just understand what I just said? Because it's amazing, right? It's not that she will just be reassured after having taken her radiograph that she is fit, that she doesn't have any illness. This young lady to whom henceforth a glass house will hold no terror. So the thing that he introduces in the middle is this young lady who from now on will not be afraid, will not have terror of living in a glass house. So the glass house acts as the symbol of both a new form of surveillance and of health. If you think that this is a weird thing, exactly the same kind of associations can be seen in the discourse around canonic works of modern architecture, like the Farnsworth House again. In an interview in House Beautiful, Edith Farnsworth, a successful doctor in Chicago, compared her famous weekend house designed by Mies in 1949 to an X-ray, and she says, I don't keep a garbage can under my sink. Do you know why? Because you can see the whole kitchen from the road on the way in here, and the can will spoil the appearance of the whole house. So I hide it in the closet farther down from the sink. Mies talks about free space, but this space is very fixed. I can't even put a clothes hanger in my house without considering how it will affect everything from the outside. Any arrangement of furniture becomes a major problem because the house is transparent like an X-ray. So again, she makes the connection between the transparency of her house, this is her bedroom, and an X-ray. Of course, the metaphor of the X-ray was not accidental. Modern architecture cannot be understood outside tuberculosis. In that sense, it's not by chance that Farnsworth goes on to say of the house that there is a local rumor that the house is a tuberculosis sanatorium, right? So the house looks like an X-ray, and there is a local rumor that it's a sanatorium. In fact, the development of X-rays and of modern architecture coincide. Just as the X-ray exposes the inside of the body to the public eye, at exactly the same time, the modern building also decides to expose its interior. That which was previously private is now subjected to public scrutiny. A new clarity of vision, a penetrating gaze, liberates a new architecture, an architecture whose structure is meant to be as clear as the gaze looking in. Also, the story goes. Because actually, what really fascinated architects like Mies and Johnson, and we have already heard Johnson saying that, was not the way the gaze passed through the glass, but precisely what fascinated Mies and Johnson after was the way the gaze gets caught in the layer of reflections. In canonic photographs, the house, we already seen it, appears completely opaque, clad in what Philip Johnson will describe as wallpaper. For Mies and Johnson, reflections in a way consolidate the plane of the wall. The complex lines of trees become in Mies building like veins like the veins in marble, for example. When explaining his glass house, Johnson precisely quoted Mies' words from 25 years before, and he says, this is Mies' words quoted by Johnson, "I discovered by working with actual glass models that the important thing is the play of reflections and not the effect of light and shadow as in an ordinary building." When Mies said that, when he talks about this glass model that he was playing with, he was probably thinking about talking about these glass models that he had done when working on the glass skyscraper. And of course, we know the canonic images, and these have emerged only recently from the archives, where you can see that Mies spent a lot of time trying to figure out what these models were supposed to do, photographing them in the garden until he arrived to the canonic images that you know that I saw before. Charles and Ray Eames also went to considerable trouble to photograph or to study the reflections of their house. For example, in this early project, the Bridge House, which is the early project for their Eames house, they placed the model of the project on the side, on the actual side of the house, and photographed it from every angle. And in so doing, I think they took Mies' experiment one step further, because with the Eames house, you can say that the plane is broken, that the reflections of the eucalyptus trees endlessly multiply and relocate. As Ray Eames say, after 13 years of living in the house, the structures, he says, long ago ceased to exist. I'm not aware of it. They live in reflections and the reflections of reflections. I think that SANAA and Seijima, Kazuyo Seijima, goes further in producing this layering of reflections on the inside as well as the outside. The blurring of reflection is no longer at the outside limit of the space as it is in Mies or in Johnson. The whole space, you can say, is at the limit. There is no clear cut inside or outside. The space is neither in nor out and seems to extend into infinity. As you can see here, this is Novartis, by the way, and this is Kanazawa, the museum of the 21st century. In such a space, walls are not optical barriers, but optical intensifiers. The walls are exposed along with the people and the objects. The limits of the wall, as you can see here, are exposed, the inner and the outer edges, but most importantly, the gap between them, this inaccessible gap of the wall itself becomes the real space of the project. This double line of the wall marks and then undoes any sense of solidity in the project. You see how milky they are? And this is a very deliberate representation of SANAA. It's very interesting because you probably have seen now images that represent this pavilion transparent. And she gave a lecture at Columbia a year ago, and I was talking to her, and she said something in the lecture that I was really struck. She said, there are all these photographers that go there and spend, if it's necessary, entire days until they manage to get an image in which you see the pavilion as transparent. But see, it's not transparent if you actually just make a picture. It's more like, and that's the effect that you can see from all the renderings that he was trying to produce, this more kind of blurry view, this kind of more oceanic view. So SANAA's vision, as you can see, is far from crystal clear. In fact, the glass pavilion seems to be more about blurring of the view, a softening of the focus than about the transparency of the early European avant-garde. In SANAA's work, no structure is ever revealed. Their buildings are not even structures you look into or look out from. They are optical devices without visible mechanism. The real view, in other words, is not from the outside looking in or the inside looking out, but the inside looking even farther in, not to discover the inner secrets of the building, but to be suspended in the view itself. In Toledo, the visitor is literally suspended between the carving walls of glass. What you see through the glass layer in front of you is yet another layer and then another. Even the objects displayed through all these layers are themselves made of glass. Looking through the layers, the vision is softened and distorted, with the curves accentuating the distortion. So Seijima is the inheritor of Miesian transparency, the latest, if you want, in a long line of experiments following all Mies. She's actually the ultimate Miesian, leaping beyond transparency into a whole new kind of mirage effect, as you can see here in Novartis again. So after centuries of architecture organized by the straight lines of the viewing eye, we now have an architecture formed by the soft distortions of the gaze, a kind of, if you want, more tactile experience of vision. To enter a Sejima project is to be caressed by a subtle softening of the territory. Even the reflections of the trees in the outer layer of the glass have a softness that is never found in Mies, whether it is in the renderings or in the one-to-one model. Because with such tactile sense of vision, models are crucial. They always do this one-to-one mock-up. This is a one-to-one mock-up. And in the working of the studio, countless models are made of every possible solution in order that the effect can be felt before it's fixed in the drawings. Indeed, SANAA goes for the variations whose effects are more unclear. She says, Sejima says, we try not to select options for which we can already imagine the outcome. So this is an architecture of deliberately unclear visions. The modern discourse of X-ray cutting through the outer layers to reveal secrets gives way to inner layers, endlessly folded and overlapping fabrics that intensify the mystery rather than remove it. The X-ray logic absorbed by modern architecture culminates in this dense cloud of ghostly shapes. So the clearance of glass that is used in Toledo is precisely used here to undermine clarity. Now, today there are new forms of advanced surveillance technologies in the city, and I'm going to finish here with 2 minutes on these new surveillance technologies, which represent, I think, a new model of vision that can act as a paradigm for the window, when going back to the beginning of the lecture. Of course, we cannot predict which of these technologies will be absorbed into architecture, but some are already affecting or impacting the built environment. I'm talking, of course, about handheld scanning devices that are capable of seeing through clothing, through walls, and through buildings, and are used by the military, but also increasingly by the police, and are effectively making solid walls behave like if they were glass. And they also open possibilities or even the inevitability of new kinds of architectural experiments. I'm thinking about forward-looking infrared radar, for example, FLIR, which is one such technology. It is based on the electromagnetic frequencies at which heat radiates from organisms and structures. So seemingly solid walls no longer offer privacy. Indeed, the FLIR scan reveals activity that have already finished, so you can be exposed even if you already left the building. The heat signature remains for a while. The lay, in a way, is incorporated into a new kind of vision. Bodies, again, are treated the same way as buildings, with passive millimeter imaging, PMI, for example, which is used in US customs to detect hidden weapons or contraband in clothing, or in bags or in vehicles, by actually stripping, as you can see, the outer layer away. And the image is also kind of interesting too. With the Kaya lens, anyone can use a regular camera, even a cell phone camera, to see through clothing by concentrating on the infrared spectrum. These technologies are, of course, very controversial. The use of PMI has been restricted due to privacy concerns, and the Kaya lens is now illegal in the United States and in Europe. The mid-century fear of the loss of privacy in the glass house, and also the fear of the loss of privacy with the X-ray, has reappeared. It is as if with each new technology that exposes something private, it's at first perceived as threatening and then quickly absorbed into everyday life, and we move on. So the fear of the glass box or the X-ray seems to us now almost quaint. Even the grainy, black and white, so unclear images of video surveillance seem almost already less invasive than a few years ago, almost reassuring. Perhaps today's scanning technologies will also seem quaint in the future, since each technology goes deeper and deeper into the private. The definition of private changes in response to each invasion. Meanwhile, the original glass house concept seems to have reemerged as a mobile, turning to a protective bunker, precisely with the pop mobile. So it's like a unbelievable reversal, right? Because the glass house, which represented this kind of fragility, is now a bunker, right? Designed with 4 sides of bulletproof glass after the 1981 assassination attempt of the Pope. It's like almost like a glass house on wheels, right? And more recently, soldiers in Iraq have appropriated the concept of the Pope glass, which they call precisely the Pope glass, made of making this kind of thing with all ballistic proof windshields welded on the top of their Humvees to offer protection against snipers. So, in conclusion, in changing our definitions of public and private, these new surveillance technologies, like the technologies that emerged in the early years of the 20th century, changed our understanding of architecture. Architecture is always about what is private and what is public. So architecture is also never threatened by new technologies. On the contrary, it feeds on them. So I think our field is now digesting these new models of vision that have emerged in the last few years, and I think a new architecture will inevitably emerge. Thank you very much.